Welcome to session 3 of the Mindful Eating and Mindfulness program for the Suppers program. Today, I'm going to start by talking about self-compassion. Now, as it turns out, many of us struggle to exercise self-compassion. We're very good at exercising compassion for others, but when it comes to extending that compassion to ourselves, we really fall short. And that's a very common experience. And after mindfulness started in this country and kind of blossomed, there were these little offshoots. They had, of course, mindfulness, and then they have mindfulness for eating, mindful eating. Then they have mindful self-compassion. And in the research for self-compassion, they're finding that people who are able to and can cultivate self-compassion have certain benefits. And they are as follows: that at such times, people tend to be happier. They have a greater sense of optimism, greater sense of curiosity about themselves and their life. They get more wisdom. They have diminished stress, a greater sense of well-being. They don't over-identify with their experiences as much. They tend to like themselves more. They have less depression and anxiety and greater resiliency. Now, it makes sense that you'd have those types of benefits when you are kinder and more loving towards yourself, and you could have compassion for the difficult moments that you struggle with. Now, as I said, most people don't have a whole lot of self-compassion. And if you think about it, it makes sense because the research shows that 70 to 80% of our thoughts tend to be negative, and 98% of our thoughts are repeated day after day. Well, if that's what you're up against, it makes sense, because if you have this closed loop of information that just keeps cycling, it makes sense that there's no room for self-compassion because you're closed in to all this negativity. So learning self-compassion is really important. Now, in my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to kind of superimpose the idea of being more compassionate from the outside in. It doesn't work that way. It makes more sense to me that we have self-compassion, we just need to grow it from within. So let me start by describing the 4 parts of the definition of what it means to have self-compassion. Firstly, when we have self-compassion, we have this ability to be open to and moved by our experiences, our struggles, and our suffering. Most people aren't open to and moved by their struggles and their suffering. They tend to push it away. They're in a battle with it. So there is a difference of how we approach it. So you want to be open to it. Secondly, you want to be able to hold that information and that suffering and that sense of discomfort, be it in your thoughts or your feelings, in a balanced way, without needing to over-identify with it, but just to say, hey, this is a moment of struggling. This is a moment of suffering for me. I'm having a hard time right now. But recognize it for what it is and don't get too overly indulgent in it. Thirdly, it means to have more of a caring attitude and a sense of kindness towards yourself in those moments, instead of a harsh attitude that's really critical and causes people to beat themselves up. And fourthly, when people have self-compassion, it means that they recognize that this is part of the common human experience. We all struggle with suffering. We all struggle with disappointment and emotions and hard times. So the question is, how do we do this? Where does this come from? Well, I'm going to start by reading a wonderful quote from a book called Fully Present. And this is a great book about mindfulness practices. And in this one section, they quote an anonymous source, and it goes like this. One evening, a Native American elder told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, "My son, the battle is between two wolves inside all of us. One wolf that is anger, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, and superiority. The other is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, and compassion." The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf wins?" The elder simply replied, "The one you feed." So the message is pretty clear here. What he's saying is that we have the seeds of both. We have the seeds of really self-compassion or the seeds of almost self-hatred and beating ourselves up. And the question is, which are you going to feed? Which are you going to nurture? Which are you going to reinforce? Now, one way to do this is what's called loving kindness practices or loving kindness meditations. And these are sayings that people have accumulated across time that people can say over and over again to themselves. And it tends to be very beneficial in watering the seeds of self-compassion. And there's one in particular that you will have in your handouts that I would like to read. It goes as follows. This is a moment of suffering. Suffering is part of life. May I be kind to myself. May I give myself the compassion I need and deserve. Now, that particular passage, a lot of people like. And people tell me that they put it on their phone, and when they're at work or they're struggling, they'll take it out and they'll read it to themselves. They'll remind themselves of it. And it's wonderful because it's a way of breaking that closed loop of negativity and injecting something that's more realistic and more constructive and more helpful. So the first line, this is a moment of suffering. It's acknowledging, hey, I'm struggling right now. Suffering is part of life. Say, hey, it makes sense. This is part of life. I'm struggling. It makes sense. We all go through it. May I be kind to myself. There comes the new message. Be kind to yourself. May I give myself the compassion I need, which you need at points of struggling and suffering, and deserve. So it really is quite helpful for people to give themselves this message. After you do it enough, you'll learn it and you'll be able to give it to yourself naturally. I want to point out that self-compassion is not that foreign to us. We all exercise it to some degree, even though we may not be aware of it. So for instance, when you choose to take this 3-session program, that's an exercise in self-compassion. When you sit down to eat mindfully and not give in to the emotional eating, the stress eating, the false hunger cues that I talked about, and you bring a sense of awareness to the moment, that's self-compassion. When you take a breath before you eat, that's self-compassion. If you feel stressed out and you get in the car and before you turn the engine on, you take a moment just to breathe and settle yourself, that's self-compassion, that's nurturing yourself. And that's what we want to develop. And you all have the capacity for it. You all can exercise it more and more because you're doing it already. So there's another quote here that I came upon recently that I found was really helpful. So I'd like to share it with all of you. It's from an anonymous source and it goes as follows. What if each time you experienced an emotion, you acknowledged it, accepted it, and became curious about its message for you? Imagine how this would change your life. Imagine how heard, loved, and honored you would feel if you really listened to yourself. This writer is really talking about mindfulness and mindful eating because what they're saying is be curious about your emotions. Its message, it's giving you a message, it's trying to tell you something. Okay? If you could hear it, you could love it and honor it. That would be so helpful to you. So instead of fighting yourself, you're shifting your approach to going towards it instead of away from it, and you're trying to gently embrace it with acceptance, curiosity, and compassion. Beautifully written. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about cravings. Now, cravings can come from two sources. They could either be physiological in nature, or they could be psychological, or they could be both. Now, if they're physiological, there's really no issue. You know, your body needs water, it's dehydrated. There's a craving for water, you drink. Okay. If your body needs protein, you give it protein. You need energy. Okay? If it's psychological, you may want to satisfy it with food, you may not. As it turns out, when it is a psychological craving, it tends to be one of three types. It's either stress-induced, it's memory-induced, or it's emotionally induced. Michelle May has written about mindful eating, and she has a quote about cravings. She says, "Mindfulness awareness of the present moment puts space between your craving and your response, giving you an opportunity to gather information and choose how you will respond." So what she's saying is when you have a craving, you have a choice. You could satisfy it right away, or you could allow some time to go by, some space. If you allow time, it gives you the opportunity to gain information and respond more appropriately. As it turns out, when you have a craving, if you satisfy it immediately, you lock it up. You shut the door. You deprive yourself of the opportunity to learn from that craving. If you choose, when you have the craving, to let some time go by and just sit with the discomfort, which is all right to do, you open the opportunity, you open the door to gather information and to learn about your relationship to food. You start to learn about the underpinnings of your cravings. So, when you have a craving, what can you do? Well, first you acknowledge, hey, I'm in the throes of a craving. And when we're in a craving moment, we tend to be agitated and our thinking gets to be narrowed and we can't think of possibilities because we have this tunnel vision of what we want. So we start by taking a deep breath, which de-escalates us. We try to center ourselves, very simply put, okay? And allow yourself to be uncomfortable for a little while. And in that time, you could ask yourself some questions. Is this false hunger or genuine hunger? Okay, if you had a meal a half an hour ago, a full meal, and you're craving, well, maybe it's a false hunger. Maybe it's not the genuine need for food. Then the question is, what is it? Is it memory induced, stress induced, emotionally induced? Okay, important to look at that. And in a general sense, if you find you are hungry at that time, what are you hungry for? Are you really hungry for something else, but you're lumping it into the basket of food? Maybe it's a hunger for companionship, for sleep, for exercise, for fresh air. Okay? We want to really expand the possibilities, but if you choose to eat immediately when the craving hits, you lose all these opportunities. Now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about an acronym called RAIN. And this is a wonderful concrete technique you can use anytime, anywhere. If you're feeling stressed out, you're feeling emotional, you're having a craving, you could check this out. It can be very helpful. Now, in the acronym RAIN, R stands for recognize and relax into what is arising. So the idea here is that instead of trying to run hysterically from it, instead of being reactive to it, we're going to recognize it and we're going to try the best we can to relax into it, to settle into it, to accept that this is part of this moment, and that's all right. Second is acceptance, allow. That's the A part of RAIN. We want to try to accept it as best we can and allow it the best we can. Doesn't mean we have to like it, but we want to gain an ability to learn from it and to show ourselves we can tolerate it. We don't have to run from discomfort. Because the more we can show ourselves that we don't have to run from it, the more confidence we get in being able to manage the difficult moments in our life. So we want to accept it and allow it. Next is I, which stands for investigate. And that means we want to be aware of the body sensations at these difficult moments. Is the heart pounding and the legs shaky? Do we have a headache? What's going on? What body sensations do we have? What thoughts are running through our head? What feelings are we having right now? And I'm not saying to get into a narrative about it. What I am saying is just to be aware of it. I'm not suggesting that you analyze it, that you think about it, intellectualize it. None of that. Just be aware of it. Okay? Now, you can view it as the person on the platform who sees all these trains going by. So you're the person on the platform and you're aware of the trains going by. In this instance, the trains are the thoughts, the trains are the emotions, and the trains are the body sensations. And they're trains in the sense that they come and go fast. They don't stay around that long. So you are just in a state of observation of these things. And the last part is N for notice. Notice is just that. As you're on the platform, you're just noticing the trains. And what happens is when people have difficult moments, they assume they have to do something about it. They have to get rid of it. You don't. It will go all by itself, especially if you give it attention. And most people think, no, we'll do just the opposite. The worst thing you can do in trying to get rid of difficult moments is to try to get rid of difficult moments. So what I'm saying is it's not so much the difficult moment that's the problem, it's your relationship to it, and it's that urgent need to try to push it away that creates more suffering. Okay? So that being said, as I come to a close for today, what I'd like to do is mention the issue of where you go from here. Okay, you've had 3 sessions with me. You've learned a lot about mindful eating and about mindfulness. How do you go forward? Well, I have some suggestions for you. The first suggestion is your attitude. If your attitude is, this is something else I have to do. I can't take anything else on. I got too much going on in my life. If that's your attitude, it's going to make it hard to adopt these practices. If your attitude is, hey, maybe I could think of this kind of like a hobby, something to be curious about, something to have fun with, that attitude is much more inviting. There's an old saying, your attitude determines your altitude. And I really believe that. So if your attitude is more of welcoming it, you'll embrace it, okay? The second thing is you want to be creative and have a plan of daily practice. And the more specific you get in that plan, there's a greater chance that you will actually be able to fulfill it and succeed. So, for instance, are you going to decide that every morning for breakfast, you're going to be mindful and bring awareness to that eating experience? That could be a good way to start. Just start with breakfast, okay, each day. Also, you could decide each day you want to have a meditation practice going on, 10 minutes of meditation. Very simple. When am I going to fit in the meditation? Be very specific. Okay, I'm going to allow for 10 minutes in the morning before I have to go to work. I'll sit down and meditate. There's a greater chance you'll do it if you're that specific. Okay. You could also do readings. There is so much to read about mindful eating and about mindfulness. And I do a lot of that, and I do it in part because it's a wonderful reminder. It keeps me on track. And that's something you can do. It's a very enjoyable reading. It's fascinating stuff. Also, you could listen to YouTube videos, which are very helpful. There's a lot out there. And the next question is, how do you approach it in terms of the time element? I'll tell you what I mean by that. In my last group of 8 sessions of mindful eating, a woman came to me at the end and she said to me, and I'm going to quote her on this, "I have so far to go." Now, what's interesting about that is she has a way of thinking about doing these practices, which she wanted to do, but I've got so far to go, makes it sound like she's got this mountain to climb. And the idea here is we don't want to get stuck into this past, present, future mindset. Instead, we want to have the mindset of just being present. It's so much better. If she would have cut that down into just this moment, it would seem a lot more manageable. Okay? The reason why people in AA say one day at a time, because it's too overwhelming to think of a lifetime of sobriety, so they cut it down. And I'm suggesting you do the same thing here, but instead of just this day, it's just this moment. And if you do that and focus on the moment, you will find it's much more manageable. And lastly, many people will ask me, how do I get a teacher? Where do I get guidance for this? Well, if you want a teacher, as it turns out, you do have a teacher. You have a teacher that is with you every moment, and that is this moment. So my point is that if you were to just see the moment as the teacher, there's a lot to learn. So by that, I mean, if you each moment, as best you can, no one's perfect, but if you could bring yourself back to the moment and be present, that is teaching yourself. That's going to give you information. If you're eating and you bring yourself back to the moment and see what's going on there, there's a learning opportunity. Okay? If you choose to sit down to meditate, that's a learning opportunity. Okay? Each moment, if you are walking and you bring yourself back into your body instead of being in your head, that's a learning opportunity. Each moment of awareness is learning. So with that, I would like to just to review with you that in the handouts you have been given, there's one section in the references about mindful eating books that I suggest you check out. There's another section of mindfulness books that are wonderful reading opportunities. I list several websites that can be helpful. And also there are some additional resources on self-compassion guides that are very helpful to people if they want to work on that issue. So with that, I thank you very much for participating in these 3 sessions. I really enjoyed it. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to call me or email me. And with that, I will take your questions.